world. So if you have questions about how that works, we're gonna have something to throw in this. Questions, and maybe from the prep work or about what's coming?
Well, I'm sure you're going to talk.
Yeah.
And I more or less understood what was going on because it's super basic. But then when I went to I started using the lenses, the study lenses, the thing on the virtual server,
Yeah.
all that. Then I started to do the first exercise, like organizing the program, like different parts, different lines, and then I just
That's if you look at the list of objectives, that those exercises are harder. And one of the things we're going to do today is go through some of the ways you can study code. So that's one of the goals today, is to figure out how to use those different types of exercises.
Okay, perfect.
Got it.
So yeah, quick raise of hands. Who did manage to get the study lenses thing set up and running? Who didn't? We can go around and help you once we go to small groups. Okay. So once see the hands up one more time if you still need help. Okay, so we'll get to you as soon as things start. So what we're going to look at today is this folder called programming. And I'm going to try to keep the theory minimal, but what we're going to start with is we're going to put programming in a place so that you can look around the code and imagine what's happening instead of just throwing language features at you and saying this is a variable, this is a loop. We're going to start with where does programming fit in everything, and then you'll start to pick apart how the different pieces in a program, so the different lines, sort of play different roles and fit into the same picture in a different way. So the first thing to keep in mind about programming is you can print a program on paper. It's just text, it's words, it's things that you write, like an email, but the biggest difference is you're writing for different people. When you write an email in English or whatever language is your home language, whatever you're writing in, you know that the other person is going to read your letter and more or less understand the same thing as you. You might write differently for a kid than for an adult. But with code, what gets tricky is you can't write a different letter for the computer as for the other developers. You need to write one document that can be understood and meaningful for three very different audiences. So when you write a piece of code, you're writing it for a developer to read, just like you're leaving a note explaining what you were thinking and what you did. You need your program to also be valid instructions for a computer. So you need to learn, how is the computer going to read my code? How's the developer going to read my code? And through the computer, how is a user going to use my program? So we're going to look at that in this tiny little silly program. We're going to see how does a computer read it, how does a user experience it, and how can a developer figure out what you're thinking. So there's this diagram. Programming is communication. Everyone says that online everywhere, and I've tried to actually make that concrete here. And so you have a document of code, and that's this middle. That's in the center of all the communication is the code that you write. So far, with the projects you've done, you haven't really had to worry about the computer. We'll see that a little more about that in a minute. But when you write HTML and CSS, you put it in the browser and a website comes out, and you don't really care what happens in the middle. You write code, you see the final product, that's it. So up till now with with like the workflows module, you're really focusing on how do you and a couple other developers plan and discuss Markdown. So your code in those first couple of weeks was just Markdown. But you had code reviews, you had pull requests, you had issues. You got, when you opened the Markdown, it showed you something. when something went wrong, it kind of gave you a little error, but not so much because Markdown was simple. With UX UI design, you started learning about how you as a developer talk directly with a user to figure out what they need and if your software is working for them. But we still ignored this part because we didn't really care about the computer. You put HTML in and something comes out. But what's going to change with JavaScript is the computer becomes very important. And what's more important at this point is actually what happens between starting your program and the program finishing. What matters less is what the program does by the end. And what matters more is how the computer got to the end. So with this module, you're going to start to look at the whole picture. And there's going to be a lot of tracing exercises that focus on how the computer reads your code. So we have this silly little program that asks you to type cat. It sits in the middle. What we're going to see when we run it is the user just gets a little pop-up and it says, can you please enter cat? And then they type something and they hit enter. And then it tells them if it was a cat or not. So that's the user's experience. It's not very exciting, but there is a user experience. What we're going to learn then is to step behind the user interface and see the computer that's making it happen. We're going to look at how does the computer go step by step through these instructions to display a pop-up box. How does it process the data and decide what to ultimately tell the user? But we're also going to take some time to see how you can use comments and logs to help a developer understand what's happening inside the program. Questions? So I know this is big in theory and abstract, but there's little quizzes and everything. We're going to get down to every detail. Questions on this? All right. So you can read all the rest of that later. It's a lot of words. Let's talk about JavaScript quickly before we go to small groups. Just basic questions that you guys might have for us about what is JavaScript, why are you learning JavaScript and not Java or not Python? Any questions? Yes.
Yes, the difference between the Java and JavaScript, also with some programs like Firebase and yeah, because yeah, a little bit safety, but some developers tell me that no, they are not the same and many differences between them.
I think Java and JavaScript, it's easier to answer by saying what they have in common, which is their name, and they kind of look the same on the page. Besides that, they have absolutely nothing to do with each other. The other stuff, you guys want to answer? You have more experience with other things. Right?
Yeah, PHP is also used for making web pages, but computation happens on the server. And with JavaScript, it happens on the client's computer. So you download the entire website, so to say, and you download a CSS file, HTML file, and a JavaScript file from the server on your device, and it runs it on your device. That's the difference.
So PHP is for backend management of that database.
Yeah.
No, it's not really for database, really, but it's your code is coming from the server, which is not, and JavaScript is actually the only language that your browser can understand without you have to do something special. So you can open your browser, you can open your console and just type JavaScript and your browser will know it, but it will not know PHP, it will not know Java, it will not know any of these languages. For the browsers to know any of those languages, you first have to do something on the server and then send it to your browser in another way. So JavaScript is actually the only thing that your browser will understand without you have to do anything special. And that's why it's the most used for web development, because your browser understands it already and you don't have to do anything to compile it to JavaScript or to do something extra.
Apparently they regret naming it JavaScript because it makes things confusing when they established it. Java was very interesting and often the newest thing and the most used thing. That's why they named it JavaScript. But afterwards, it doesn't really have any correlation besides the name and some programming. Besides that, it's totally different.
the difference between Java and JavaScript is like the difference between car and carpets. So
Yeah, like they mentioned, you can, there's different ways to run JavaScript and it's still in the browser. The simplest way, like you mentioned, is in the console. So like here's some code, you can just copy paste it. And just so this thing that you've been using to inspect the DOM in your websites the whole time, if you click on this little console tab, you can write JavaScript here. And it will run. So here I paste in this program and I hit enter, and it does a little pop-up box. And that's pretty much how we're going to be running things for the next quite a while. You'll be clicking the run button instead. You won't have to copy paste it. But we're basically just running little pieces of JavaScript directly in the browser without any HTML or CSS. You can also open, this is something you'll see in a lot of tutorials. We'll see this also later in the course when you start learning how to interact with the DOM. Don't worry if that makes no sense. You can write JavaScript in a script tag. So here, if I want to re-render it, it also gives me a little pop-up. So you can have an HTML file with a script tag, and you can write JavaScript in there. You can also have a separate file, so source.js, and in your index.html file, you can script source equals source.js. That's another way to run JavaScript in a website. And then it's just the JavaScript file is just .js, and it only has JavaScript in it. There's also a funny little thing called ES modules that we'll learn about much later. So these are the 3 basic ways that you can get JavaScript running in a browser. Or the 4. Step 0 is you just write it here and hit enter. But that's not useful. You can't save your changes. You can't build a full project. You can just run a couple lines of code and see what they do. You can write a JavaScript directly in the script tag in an HTML file. Or you can write your JavaScript in a separate file and require it. But this is just to situate things. You've seen HTML files, you know that they make a user interface. So you can just pull the script right inside of that. But for now, we're not going to see that until separation of concerns. So that's just to give you a little idea of where you can run JavaScript and how. You can also run it outside of the browser in Node.js for servers. But that's, again, not at all for us right now. So JavaScript, it's a language in browsers for web development. It's the only one browsers use, so we're learning it. No other reason than that. Let's go to small groups and work your way through, starting with 1. Unless you guys have anything else to add? No? All right.
Should we?
So you needed help getting set up. 4 of you over there.
Randomizer?
Yeah, I figured just sitting next to each other, but let's do the randomizer. First, though, everyone online, should we form groups of fully online people?
There is only 2 people online that are not here. Others have been.
Would one of you guys be willing to help the online group?
Sure.
Okay.
Find out amongst yourself.
You want to do it? Okay.
And then
Prevent arguing.
do a random for the rest. Because not everyone is here, so there'll be a lot of empty people in the group.
Yeah. Let's just make it randomly 3 or 4.
Or do we just go chunk?
Then how many are
Just
there?
self-selection.
Wow. So 4 or 3? 3 or 4. Let's make 3 or 4.
Yeah, let's make groups of 3.
So 4.
4 groups of 3.
Yeah, all right, then
4 groups of 3.
so 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, I should not be the front and the Ali, 3 girls and 1 boyfriend. 3 or 3 together.
All right, right.
Okay, we're gonna be good.
I'm gonna work in with your group today. So,
Do you have a study?
whatever you guys want.
Wait, I can send you. Yeah, I can send you.
So, we're supposed to try to understand this first.
Yeah, what we're gonna do.
We're gonna just-
Yeah, we're gonna do some exercises, which first off, does everybody manage to get this sitting up?
Yeah.
So everybody has this installed and spaces.
Wait, let me send you.
So you have it, let's see, do you have access to this?
Yes.
To the exercises, it's the thing that have an sort of a GitHub pages thing.
Okay, you can write your email.
Yes, you can.
Here, email.
And this is me. I
There
am
you
in
are.
it,
Yeah,
but I
already in the
can't.
chat.
But I can't join it on my it's
Already.
it's interesting. I can't log in. But whatever, I'll just copy from my phone and then join the Zoom call.
Okay.
Through it then.
Let me find you here, then maybe if I mention your name.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, just we go with exercises and that's one.
In the programming chapter, the folder.
In the programming.
Oh, yeah, that's it.
So they're in the programming chapter, there's exercises.
Hello, Jalila.
Yeah, yes. I'm going to assign you a coach and then you're going to work with him, all right?
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, exactly. And if you have any questions with anything, then I'll be here. I will take a look at it myself as probably handy to help you guys.
Oh no, I have it.
Yeah, but it also doesn't matter.
Maybe should we do it through here? I can unplug it from here and then you can just do it here.
Yes, no problem. Just do it from my-
Perfect. Oh, okay.
So we're supposed to study this first, like also the
Yeah.
medical here.